In this mini-series, we're going to look at how to train around injuries. Unfortunately, in climbing, a lot of us get injured, but you can still improve and train around them. So we're going to look at injuries focused on the fingers, elbows, shoulders and knees, and how you can train and improve around them. So stay tuned, watch this episode, and make sure to check out the other ones that are coming up soon. So in this series, we're going to look on how to train around an injury. So we're not looking at the specific rehab on the injured area. We're going to look on how to improve the rest of your body and maintain climbing movement despite the fact that you've got an injury. This is a really good tool to try and use, and we use it with loads of climbers that we work with here at Lattice. And it's something to keep you occupied both mentally and physically during the early stages of rehab or when you're trying to rest. We're going to be focused on how to maintain finger strength, how to keep up your climbing movement and adapt any conditioning exercise to the injured area so that you can maximize all of your training sessions. So I'll have to start with a little caveat. My aim of this series is to help you train and stay motivated during early stages of rehab when you've just been injured. So it's looking at all the other areas of the body. I'm not a medical professional who will be focusing on that injured area. Most injuries are going to be unique to the person, and if you're ever unsure about the protocols I'm suggesting in this, or what else you need to do, it's always worth checking in with a medical professional and getting some specific advice for your unique injury. So my first bit of general advice, which is applicable to not only this video and the exercises we're focusing on today, but in all of the exercises throughout the series, is to try and monitor the injured area despite training around it. So we can monitor it in two different ways. One is the pain or discomfort felt in the injured area during any of these exercises or any of the other exercises you might be doing on top of this. And two is to monitor the discomfort or the reaction that you feel the day after the training that you complete. So regarding the pain and discomfort at the time, if we use a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being there's no pain at all and 10 being really, really painful, we need to try and keep it as low as possible. So even if we're not using that particular muscle or finger or part of the elbow during an exercise, it's still worth keeping note how you feel after the session and how much pain and discomfort you feel. If those numbers start to creep up during the session or week after week, we know that something's being used too much and you need to either change the exercises, reduce the load, or rest a little more. Measuring the reaction the next day is also just as important. So what I mean by reaction is usually in the morning, how stiff or swollen or uncomfortable does that area feel, so the injured area. So once again, use a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being it feels absolutely normal, there's no swelling, there's no discomfort, and there's no stiffness in the injured area, and 10 being the absolute opposite, so it's feeling really bad and it feels like it's got much worse. So once again, if those numbers are starting to get higher, it means that the exercises you did the day before is obviously not very good for the area, so you need to try and reduce the exercises, reduce the loading, or change something up slightly. If it starts to go down progressively, that means we're doing something right and you can still carry on doing those same workouts that you've completed the day before. I'd really recommend doing both of these scales on rest days and training days so you're keeping a really good log on whether it's improving or not. If the numbers keep going up, then you need to address it, but if the numbers keep going down, you can start to increase the load and volume nice and slowly, bit by bit, and make sure that you're getting back to normal training and normal climbing. Once it's hitting 0 all the time, it sounds like you're good to go. And just be careful, but you can start adding on more normal climbing load and volume. In today's video, we're going to be looking at finger injuries. And the example I'm going to use is a pulley strain. Pulley strains are something that loads of climbers come up against, from beginner climbers all the way to the most advanced elite climbers. So if you want to know a little bit more about the actual details of what a pulley strain is, I'd recommend Googling it and looking on a specific climbing physio website to give you more details. Once again, I'm not going to be looking at the specific rehab of a pulley strain, but we're going to be looking at how you can train around that on your fingers and whilst climbing. So trying to maintain or even improve finger strength whilst you got a finger injury is a little bit of a frustrating process. So there's a couple of ways of doing this, and there's a couple of things that I personally think you need to try and avoid, or little pitfalls that you could quite easily fall into. So the main thing with improving finger strength if you've got a finger injury is one, today's example, I do actually have a little bit of a pulley strain, so it's easy to work around, but I've got a pulley strain on one hand and a completely healthy other hand. So you can always improve one hand. Now you can see that I'm holding a portable fingerboard, and the reason for that is if we're using a fingerboard at home, I find it quite hard to either resist pulling on with the other hand or testing it out with the fingers, or it does get a little bit tiring if you do a couple of weeks of fingerboarding just on the one arm. So you can do one arm fingerboarding and use a pulley setup, and you can do max hangs and doing the same processes that I'll cover here. But if you do have the opportunity to use an edge of some sort or a pinch block and do the same thing lifting weights, I can find that a lot more controllable, and it's also a little bit easier to do all the different things we're about to cover now. So one thing I'd always recommend doing when you're training finger strength or your fingers at all, if you've got an injury, is to try and keep some tape on. Whether it supports it or not, what it does do is prevent it from going into the position which could be quite uncomfortable. So for me here, if I was trying to push down into a half crimp on my injured finger, this tape will actually prevent it from going that far, and it can be really useful to do that. Because if you're training your other fingers, or if you're training a certain position and you want to avoid that grip position, it gives you a little bit more resistance, which stops it going into the area which hurts the most. So for me, like I've said, using this edge is a really good way to be training the fingers that are healthy. And you can be doing that using as much load as you want, or can do as a normal max hang. So using a healthy hand, it means that my shoulders aren't going to get an imbalance or any sort of loading, because pulling from upwards is going to be a lot less stress on the shoulder and elbows than like hanging from a fingerboard. So I can really load up this arm and train as normal, just doing simple max hang routines and trying to develop this arm, because I've got one injured side, but I don't need to actually limit the gains in the other side. So what we're going to actually do on this side, a lot of people tend to try and focus on the fingers which aren't in use. So I've got a slight ring finger strain, and there's a couple of things that I'm going to find useful in the next few weeks. One is to make sure that I know that what positions particularly hurt it. For me, it's going to be an A2 strain. So anything positive where it's got a sort of angle in the joint, that's going to be a lot worse for my finger. And I can easily tell that by just the discomfort of putting a little bit of pressure there. So that's the main thing that I need to avoid. As my fingers start to recover and I get over that initial phase of the first couple of weeks, I can start potentially training the other fingers on the hand. So for me, to keep the load really low and not stress that finger, I'm going to just do single finger hangs and lifts. So it might sound really hard, but it's actually not too bad at all, because you can always change the weight with this setup. And this is why using an edge to pick weight up is better than a fingerboard. So in this instance, I'm going to use a nice simple load, just a small amount that I'm comfortable with, and I've warmed up as I normally would on the fingers as well. So I've not warmed up with my full hand, because I'm trying to reduce the load on this hand. And then on my front two fingers, what I'm going to do is start to do single finger lifts. So that could either be in a mono position, like an open hold, or it can even be in that half crimp hold, just with one finger. Now, the thing that you're looking out for here is that when you're putting the stress in this finger, you're always going to be doing a bit of shared load, and it's going to be pulling on this side of your hand as well on the injured finger. So it's always worth keeping the load much lower than you might think, despite it not being on the actual stressed finger at all. So in this case, I would do my middle finger and my index, and I'll do a really light load, but I'm going to do it in a half crimp, and that's going to keep me a little bit more recruited than if I didn't do it at all. I'm actually not going to bother doing it on my pinky because I think that's quite an awkward position to do. If you've got a middle finger strain or an index finger strain, you can obviously do the other fingers as well. And that's when you can do them together as a front two or middle two, or even back two if you wanted to, if their fingers are healthy. But the main thing is that you're keeping the load low and ideally using a single digit. So the last part of this training that you're going to be doing trying to maintain finger strength is using the grip position, which is comfortable for the fingers. Like I said earlier, you already know what position hurts more, so that'll be that half crimp for me right now. So you can start to slowly load the fingers in that comfortable grip position. So for me, that'll be a 3-finger drag. If I put the pinky on, it's going to kink that finger a bit and make it uncomfortable. So I'm going to stay really open in a 3-finger drag. And the reason why I can still do this, and it'll become part of my training, is the fact that the pulley that's strained isn't actually in use as much in this position. If you want more details on where your finger's actually hurting, then like I said, have a look online. But you can usually tell this using that metric scale that I talked about earlier. So 1 being no pain, 10 being a lot of pain. So if it's causing you pain in the session or it's causing discomfort, then it's worth avoiding this exercise. If you have any issues tomorrow where it's getting stiffer or swollen, then it's also worth avoiding this exercise. But if it feels pain-free or not very comfortable at all, and tomorrow it feels okay, then it obviously means that this position is okay. A lot of climbers have become really strong in a drag if they've got an A2 strain because they've done training in this position whilst they couldn't crimp or half crimp. So keep the load nice and low, don't push it, don't try to get maximum strength gains, but use the grip position, which isn't going to cause any issues. Keep this in mind because when we go onto the climbing wall later, we'll be using the same principle. Climbing around a finger injury can be really fun and improve your climbing quite a lot. So there's a couple of things that we often use with our clients and what we've used personally ourselves. You might be able to even see there's like a little green traverse behind. So one thing that I tend to focus on when I've got a finger injury is making sure that I'm spending this time really working on the body parts which can be used to their absolute maximum. And that is often going to be on slab climbing. So that means you can either be doing really technical slab climbing and just avoiding using that finger in use. So I've set I've been lucky here that I can set a little climb, but you can do this anywhere around in your local walls. And I've just been using sort of the front 2 fingers, trying to use as little weight on my hands as possible and spending loads of time on my feet. For any route climbers, trad climbers, this is absolutely brilliant. But for boulderers, it's also useful because you can really top up that footwork skill set that you've got. If you've watched any of the recent World Cups, you can see those who have got amazing footwork have really, really benefited from it. So don't underestimate it for bouldering either. So doing loads of slab climbing is great. That can be mixed onto one-arm climbing as well and no hands climbing because you've got so much weight on your feet, you can even just take away that hand completely and not put it in use at all. The next thing that I tend to keep in mind is the grip positions I'm using. Like I mentioned earlier in the fingerboarding, the grip positions that you use will be really related to the type of injury that you have and how much it's going to affect it. So if I've got an A2 strain, like I said earlier, then an open grip position will be a lot easier to use straight away. So any of the climbing I do start to incorporate will use that grip position. I'll try and keep the intensity low, but I can still do a lot of balancing moves and technical moves just in that open 3 grip position, and I can start to push my climbing more and more and giving myself feedback using that metric system we mentioned earlier. So I can keep pushing the grade and keep getting it harder and harder until I feel more comfortable, and then I'll start adding in normal grip positions again. A couple of things that I wouldn't do is a lot of people tend to go, oh, I'll do loads of aero caps, so easy endurance. I think that is a good idea, but you really need to keep the intensity low and still focus on the grip position in use. A lot of people tend to push that aerobic capacity work quite hard, and you're still going to be working that finger, and a lot of volume on it can make it worse. So really make sure that you're doing that nice and controlled, and you're trying to keep an eye on the finger positions that you're using. Because if you're doing aero cap in a full crimp and that's the thing that's hurting it, just because it's easy, the more moves is going to make it quite bad as well. So the other side of that is doing hard problems on jugs. You might think jugs are really safe. Same thing again, loads of slight pulley strains have become tenosynovitis or worse by going on doing big moves on big jugs, which are positive. Just because it's big doesn't mean it's completely safe. So build up to it slowly, and actually I would recommend not going on something too steep straight away, even if it feels like quite a big hold. Focus more on the position of your hand and how it feels, and then try and incorporate your legs a lot more. This is a really good time to work on your lower body and the skill set you have there. So try and incorporate a lot more of the technical aspects of climbing on vertical or slab terrain into this element, rather than getting straight onto the steep stuff as soon as possible. So lastly, we're going to look at conditioning around a finger injury. You might be thinking, what's going to be different about conditioning around a finger injury? But I do think there's just a couple of things to keep in mind, which I think has really helped certain climbers that I work with over the years, because I think a lot of us forget that we're still going to be using our fingers when doing any sort of conditioning exercises. So the key things to look out for is, how are you holding on to the weights that you're using? So anything like deadlifts or bar work using a big barbell like this, you're often going to be using a lot of load on it, because you need a lot of load to use those bigger muscle groups. And when we are using a lot of load, that means a lot of load's going to go through our fingers. So in these positions, if I've got a really good grip of the bar and pulling up in any sort of way, like rack pulls, deadlifts, or any sort of movements where I'm lifting weight off the ground, I'm going to be holding on with that injured finger. And you can judge this on how it feels using that same scale as before. But I do think actually it's something to be avoided generally in the initial stages whilst you're rehabbing your finger. Rather than using a bar in this position, then I think you need to look for alternatives which produce less load on each hand. Secondly, pull-up bars are exactly the same. So you could do loads and loads of pull-up exercises whilst you've got a finger injury. But sometimes it can actually reduce the recovery rate, because once again, you're loading weight through your fingers. So if you are going to do any sort of pull-ups, I'd recommend trying to make sure that your whole hand's over the bar and you're doing body weight only. If you start adding up loads of maximal load, you need to make sure this isn't making your fingers worse. So the things I would generally recommend to do conditioning wise is making the most of flexibility workouts, core workouts, and any sort of antagonist or supplementary workouts using less weight. So by that I mean using stuff like dumbbells, where you can actually change the position of your hand on the dumbbell so that you're not loading that finger. You'd still be gripping it, but instead of doing pull-ups, you could do bicep curls, where actually that finger is barely doing anything at all. And then any sort of pushing exercise, whether it's shoulder press, bench press, pushing on the ground such as press-ups, usually you're going to be having all the weight going through your palm. So by putting the weight through your palm, once again you're reducing the load in the fingers, and it means you can really push yourself and improve despite the fact that this finger is being left alone. So I hope you found all that information really useful. Like I said, this isn't supposed to be trying to help you rehab the finger injury, but we're looking at how you're going to train around it. And it means that you can really stay motivated and you can keep going to the wall or keep using your facilities to make the most of this time and hopefully come out of it even stronger and an even better climber. Please make sure to subscribe and like the episode. And if you want to learn anything else about training around other injuries, so we've got the elbow, shoulder and knee injuries coming up, then please look out for the future episodes. Hope you see you soon at the crag, and take care of that injury.